David Chen woke up every morning at 5:30, not because he had to, but because his body wouldn't let him sleep longer. 15 years of military training had programmed his internal clock to perfection, but these days, instead of jumping into combat gear, he would quietly slip out of bed and make coffee for his pregnant wife. Lisa was still sleeping when he tiptoed to the kitchen. At 6 months pregnant, she needed all the rest she could get. David smiled as he watched the coffee drip into the pot. 6 months ago, he never imagined he would find such simple pleasure in making breakfast for someone he loved. Their house was nothing fancy. A small 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood outside Colorado Springs. David had deliberately chosen this area because nobody asked questions here. His neighbors thought he worked in government security and traveled for consulting. They had no idea that the friendly guy next door had spent the last decade and a half conducting some of the most dangerous military operations in the world. David worked for Delta Force, though he could never tell anyone that. His official job title was so classified that even Lisa didn't know exactly what he did. She knew he worked for the military and that his job required him to travel to dangerous places. She worried about him, but she trusted him when he said he would always come home to her. The truth was more complicated than that. David had been to places that didn't exist on any public map. He had eliminated threats that the American public would never hear about. For 15 years, he had lived in the shadows, protecting people who would never know his name or what he had sacrificed for their safety. But everything changed when Lisa told him she was pregnant. David remembered that day perfectly. Lisa had been acting strange for a week, nervous and excited at the same time. When she finally told him the news, he felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in his adult life, he had something more important than his mission. That night, David had made a decision that surprised even himself. He submitted his retirement paperwork. His commanding officer had tried to talk him out of it. David was one of their best operators with an almost perfect mission record. But David's mind was made up. He wanted to be a father, a real father who would be there for bedtime stories and soccer games. The retirement wouldn't be immediate. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, especially for someone with David's security clearance. He would need to complete his current assignments and help train his replacement. The process would take about 6 months, which meant the baby would arrive right around the time he officially became a civilian. Lisa worked as a nurse at the Children's Hospital downtown. She loved her job, and the kids loved her back. David often watched her with the young patients and imagined how amazing she would be as a mother. She had this natural way of making people feel safe and cared for. It was the opposite of everything David had been trained to do. Sometimes David wondered how someone like him had gotten so lucky. Lisa was gentle where he was hard. She saw the good in people where he had been trained to spot threats. She brought light into rooms where he had learned to hide in shadows. They had met 3 years ago at a coffee shop near the hospital. David had been between deployments, trying to decompress from a particularly difficult mission. Lisa had been coming off a double shift and was so tired she could barely stand. When she accidentally spilled coffee on his shirt, she had been mortified. David had just laughed and offered to buy her another cup. Their first conversation lasted 4 hours. Lisa talked about her patients and her dreams of opening a clinic for underprivileged children. David found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, though he was careful to keep them vague. He told her about places he had traveled and people he had met, but never about the real reasons he had been there. By their 3rd date, David knew he was in trouble. He was falling for someone who lived in a completely different world than his. Lisa believed in healing and helping people. David's job was often about the opposite. But somehow, when he was with her, the darkness of his work seemed less heavy. Lisa never pushed him for details about his job. She seemed to understand that there were things he couldn't share. In return, David never brought his work home. When he walked through their front door, he left the soldier outside and became just David, the man who loved making Lisa laugh and could spend hours listening to her talk about her day. The pregnancy had brought them even closer together. David loved watching Lisa's body change as their baby grew. He would spend evenings talking to her belly, reading stories and playing music. Lisa would laugh and tell him the baby was too young to understand, but David didn't care. He wanted his child to know his voice from the very beginning. They had spent weekends preparing the nursery. David had painted the walls a soft yellow since they had decided to wait until birth to learn the baby's gender. Lisa had picked out a crib and matching dresser, while David had installed shelves for books and toys. Every night they would stand in the doorway of the nursery and imagine their future. David's military buddies thought he had lost his mind. They couldn't understand why someone would give up the adrenaline and purpose of special operations for suburban life. But David knew something they didn't. The rush of completing a dangerous mission was nothing compared to the feeling of Lisa falling asleep in his arms or the first time he felt the baby kick. There were moments when David's two worlds almost collided, like when Lisa asked about the scars on his back, or when he woke up from nightmares he couldn't explain. But somehow they always found their way back to each other. Lisa had this amazing ability to anchor him to the present, to remind him that he was safe and loved. David had started seeing a military counselor to help with the transition. The counselor had warned him that adjusting to civilian life would be challenging. After 15 years of high-stakes missions, normal life might feel boring or meaningless. But David didn't feel that way at all. Every day with Lisa felt like the most important mission of his life. As David finished making breakfast, he heard Lisa stirring upstairs. Soon she would come down, rubbing her eyes and complaining about how the baby had kept her awake with all the kicking. David would make her laugh with some silly joke, and they would sit together planning their day. It was such a simple routine, but it meant everything to him. In 6 months, David would officially leave the military behind. He would become a full-time civilian, a husband, and a father. He had spent years protecting strangers, but now he had his own family to protect. And unlike his military missions, this was one assignment he planned to keep forever. Lisa Chen hummed softly as she drove home from her baby shower. The back seat of her car was packed with gifts from her co-workers at the hospital. Tiny clothes, stuffed animals, baby bottles, and a beautiful handmade blanket from the head nurse who had become like a mother to her. Lisa couldn't stop smiling as she thought about showing everything to David. The shower had been perfect. Her colleagues had decorated the hospital break room with pink and blue balloons, and everyone had shared stories about their own children. Lisa had felt so loved and supported. She placed one hand on her belly, feeling the baby moving around inside. 6 months pregnant, and she still couldn't believe she was going to be a mother. The evening air was warm, and Lisa had rolled down her window slightly to enjoy the breeze. She was playing soft music from a playlist David had made for her, full of songs he thought the baby should hear. Lisa laughed, thinking about how seriously David took everything related to their child. He read pregnancy books like they were military manuals and had already baby-proofed their entire house. As she reached for her water bottle on the passenger seat, Lisa felt the car drift slightly to the left. She quickly corrected and continued driving, not thinking much of it. She was tired from the party and eager to get home to David. He had promised to have dinner waiting for her, probably something healthy and perfectly balanced because he had become obsessed with her nutrition. Lisa was stopped at a red light when she noticed the police car behind her. She didn't think anything of it at first. Police cars were common in this area, and she had never had any problems with law enforcement before. When the light turned green, she continued driving normally, still humming along to her music. But then she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Lisa's heart rate quickened slightly, but she wasn't really worried. She had been driving carefully, maybe a little slowly because of the pregnancy. She pulled over to the side of the road and turned off her music, reaching into her purse for her license and registration. She had everything David had taught her to keep organized for situations like this. Officer Jake Morrison approached her window with a flashlight, even though it wasn't quite dark yet. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a serious expression but not unfriendly. Lisa rolled down her window completely and gave him what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Morrison said politely. "I pulled you over because I noticed your vehicle weaving a bit back there. Have you had anything to drink tonight?" Lisa felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Oh no, officer. I haven't had anything to drink. I'm pregnant, so I don't drink alcohol at all. I was just reaching for my water bottle, and I guess I wasn't paying close enough attention. Tie into staying in my lane." Morrison nodded and seemed to relax slightly. "Congratulations on the pregnancy. How far along are you?" 6 months, Lisa said, placing her hand on her belly. "I was just coming home from my baby shower at work. I'm a nurse at Children's Hospital." Morrison smiled for the first time. "That's nice. My sister is a nurse too. Can I see your license and registration, please?" Lisa was reaching into her purse when another police car pulled up behind the first one. The second officer got out quickly and walked toward them with purpose. Lisa noticed that this officer seemed more tense than Morrison, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. "Everything okay here, Morrison?" the second officer called out. His name tag read Henley, and unlike Morrison, he didn't seem relaxed at all. Morrison turned toward his colleague. "Just a minor traffic stop, Henley." Driver was weaving a bit, but she explained she was reaching for something. "She's pregnant on her way home from a baby shower." Officer Henley approached Lisa's window, shining his flashlight directly into her face. Lisa blinked and raised her hand to shield her eyes from the bright light. The baby moved inside her as if responding to her sudden discomfort. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," Henley said sharply. Lisa was confused by his tone. Morrison seemed surprised too. "Henley, she's just getting her license out." But Henley wasn't listening to his partner. He was focused entirely on Lisa, studying her every movement with suspicious eyes. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Something about this officer made her nervous in a way she had never experienced before. "Officer, I'm just trying to get my documents," Lisa said slowly, trying to keep her voice calm. "My license is in my purse." "Move very slowly," Henley commanded. "Keep your other hand visible at all times." Lisa's hands were starting to shake. She didn't understand why this situation had become so tense. She had been pulled over once before, years ago, and it had been nothing like this. Morrison looked uncomfortable too, glancing between his partner and Lisa with growing concern. As Lisa carefully reached into her purse, her phone started ringing. The sudden sound made everyone jump. Henley's hand moved closer to his weapon, and Lisa felt a spike of fear that she didn't understand. "Don't answer that," Henley ordered. "It's probably my husband," Lisa said quietly. "He's expecting me home soon." Morrison stepped closer to Henley. "Hey, partner, maybe we should take this down a notch. She's clearly not a threat." But Henley was in a different headspace. 3 weeks earlier, his previous partner had been shot during what started as a routine traffic stop. The shooter had pulled a gun from exactly the same type of purse that Lisa was now reaching into. Ever since that incident, Henley had been on edge during every encounter with the public. Lisa finally found her license and slowly pulled it out, along with her registration. But as she moved to hand the documents to Morrison, her phone rang again. The sound startled her and she dropped her purse. The contents spilled onto the floor of her car, including her keys, which made a metallic clinking sound. "Gun!" Henley shouted suddenly. Lisa looked up in complete confusion. "What? No, there's no gun." "I don't have a gun." Morrison spun around to look at his partner. "Henley, what are you talking about? She doesn't have a gun." But Henley had already drawn his weapon, pointing it directly at Lisa through the open car window. Lisa's world suddenly became very small and very terrifying. She had never had a gun pointed at her before. The black barrel looked enormous, and behind it she could see Henley's eyes wide with what looked like fear and anger. "Hands up! Get your hands up now!" Henley was screaming. Lisa raised her hands immediately, her license and registration still clutched in her fingers. "Please, I don't have a weapon. I'm just trying to give you my license." Morrison had his hands out, trying to calm the situation. "Henley, she doesn't have a gun. Stand down." But Henley wasn't hearing anything except the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. In his mind, he was reliving that night 3 weeks ago when his partner had gone down. He was seeing threats that weren't there, danger where none existed. Lisa tried to stay perfectly still, but the baby was moving around inside her, responding to her stress and fear. She felt like she couldn't breathe properly. All she could think about was David, and how much she wanted to be home with him right now. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly, hoping to remind the officer that she was a human being, not a threat. "Please, I'm just trying to go home to my husband." Morrison was still trying to de-escalate. "Henley, look at her. She's 6 months pregnant. She's a nurse. She's not dangerous." For a moment it seemed like Henley might lower his weapon, but then Lisa, trying to show that her hands were empty, opened her fingers to let her license and registration fall. The small pieces of plastic hit the car door with a slight sound and Henley's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't move," he screamed. But Lisa was already moving, instinctively placing one hand protectively over her belly. It was the most natural thing in the world for an expectant mother to do. But to Henley, lost in his own fear and trauma, it looked like she was reaching for something. The first shot was deafeningly loud inside the car. then the second, then the third. Lisa felt a burning sensation in her abdomen and then a wetness spreading across her clothes. The world seemed to slow down as she looked down and saw blood seeping through her shirt. Her first thought wasn't about herself, but about the baby. Morrison was shouting something, but Lisa couldn't make out the words. Everything sounded like it was coming from underwater. She felt herself sliding down in her seat, and then everything went black. The last thing she remembered was thinking about David, and wondering if she would ever see him again. David was reviewing mission files when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it, because he was in the middle of preparing for what would be one of his final operations before retirement. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him pick up anyway. "Is this David Chen?" The voice on the other end was professional but urgent. "Yes, this is David. Mr. Chen, this is Dr. Patricia Williams at Memorial Hospital. Your wife has been involved in a serious incident. You need to come to the hospital immediately." David felt the world tilt around him. In 15 years of military service, he had received calls about wounded teammates, failed missions, and emergency situations. But nothing had ever hit him like this moment. The papers in his hand suddenly felt meaningless. What kind of incident? Is she okay? David's training kicked in, keeping his voice steady even as his heart started racing. "Mr. Chen, your wife has been shot. She's in surgery right now. I can't give you more details over the phone, but you need to get here as soon as possible." Shot. The word echoed in David's mind as he grabbed his keys and ran for the door. Lisa had been shot. His pregnant wife, the gentlest person he had ever known, had somehow been shot. It didn't make sense. She was supposed to be at her baby shower with her co-workers from the hospital, safe people in a safe place doing safe things. The drive to Memorial Hospital was 23 minutes that felt like hours. David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had driven through war zones, navigated hostile territory, and escaped from situations that would have killed most people. But this drive through familiar suburban streets was the most terrifying journey of his life. His mind kept trying to process what could have happened. A robbery? A random shooting? Had Lisa been in the wrong place at the wrong time? David had spent his career protecting people from threats they never saw coming. But he hadn't been there to protect the one person who mattered most. At the hospital, David ran through the emergency department doors. The smell hit him immediately. Antiseptic and fear and something else he recognized from combat zones. He had been in military hospitals before, but this was different. This time it was personal. "I'm looking for Lisa Chen," he told the receptionist, trying to keep his voice calm. "My wife. She was brought in with a gunshot wound." The receptionist's face softened with sympathy. "Mr. Chen, Dr. Williams is expecting you. Let me get her for you right away." Dr. Williams appeared within minutes. She was a small woman with kind eyes, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. She led him to a private consultation room, which immediately told David that the news wasn't going to be good. "Mr. Chen, your wife is in surgery right now. She was shot once in the abdomen. The bullet caused significant internal bleeding, and we're working to repair the damage." David nodded, forcing himself to stay focused. "What about the baby?" Dr. Williams paused, and David felt his heart sink. "The baby is alive but in distress. We're monitoring both mother and child closely. The next few hours are critical." "Who shot her?" David asked quietly. "The police are investigating. From what I understand, it happened during a traffic stop. I don't have all the details, police." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. Lisa had been shot by police during a traffic stop. His wife, who followed every rule and never got so much as a speeding ticket, had somehow been shot by the people who were supposed to protect her. Dr. Williams continued explaining the medical situation, but David was only half listening. Part of his mind was already shifting into the mode that had kept him alive in hostile situations. Someone had hurt his wife and angered his child. Someone would answer for that. "Can I see her?" David asked. "She's still in surgery. But as soon as she's stable, I'll take you to her." David spent the next 4 hours in the hospital waiting room. He called Lisa's parents and his own family, struggling to find words to explain what had happened. He called Lisa's supervisor at the children's hospital, who immediately offered to cover her shifts indefinitely. Everyone kept asking how something like this could happen, and David didn't have answers. Finally, Dr. Williams returned. "Mr. Chen, your wife is out of surgery. She's stable but still unconscious. The baby's heartbeat is stronger now, which is encouraging. David followed the doctor through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. When they reached Lisa's room, David stopped in the doorway. His wife looked so small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes. Her face was pale, and there was a bandage covering most of her abdomen. David approached the bed slowly and took Lisa's hand. It was warm, which somehow surprised him. She looked so fragile that he half expected her to feel cold. He could hear the baby's heartbeat on one of the monitors, a steady rhythm that gave him hope. "Can she hear me?" David asked Dr. Williams. "We're not sure, but many patients report remembering conversations from when they were unconscious. You should talk to her." David pulled a chair close to Lisa's bed and sat down, still holding her hand. For the first time since receiving the phone call, he allowed himself to really feel what was happening. His wife had been shot. His unborn child was fighting for life. The future they had planned together was hanging by a thread. "Hey, sweetheart," David whispered, leaning close to Lisa's ear. "I'm here. You're safe now. You and the baby are both going to be fine." As he spoke, David made promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He promised Lisa that everything would be okay. He promised their baby that both parents would be there for the birth. And silently he made another promise, to find out exactly what had happened and make sure the person responsible faced consequences. A nurse came in to check Lisa's vital signs and adjust some of the equipment. She was gentle and efficient, but David could see the sympathy in her eyes. News traveled fast in hospitals, and everyone knew that Lisa was one of their own. "She's well liked here," the nurse said softly. "Everyone in pediatrics is praying for her." David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had spent years protecting strangers, but he couldn't protect his own wife from the people who were supposed to serve and protect. The irony wasn't lost on him. Hours passed. David refused to leave Lisa's side, even when hospital staff offered him a more comfortable place to rest. He held her hand and talked to her about everything and nothing. He told her about the calls he had made and the people who were worried about her. He described the nursery they had finished together and reminded her about names they had discussed for the baby. Around midnight, David felt Lisa's hand twitch. He looked up to see her eyes fluttering open, confused and unfocused. "Lisa, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Lisa's eyes found his face, and David saw recognition dawn in them. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. David quickly offered her ice chips, which the nurse had said would be okay. "The baby," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "The baby is okay," David assured her. "You're both going to be fine." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, and David gently wiped them away. She tried to remember what had happened, but the memories were fragmented. She remembered the traffic stop, the officer's angry voice, the gun pointed at her, but everything after that was a blur. "Someone shot me," she said, as if she couldn't believe it. "Yes," David said simply, "but you're safe now." Lisa closed her eyes, overwhelmed by exhaustion and medication, but she kept holding David's hand as if she was afraid to let go. David stayed awake all night, watching her breathe and listening to their baby's heartbeat on the monitor. As the sun came up, David knew his life had changed forever. The quiet civilian existence he had been planning was over before it had really begun. Someone had attacked his family, and David was going to find out who and why. The soldier in him, the part he had been preparing to leave behind, was fully awake now. But first he had to make sure Lisa and the baby survived. Everything else would have to wait. While Lisa slept in her hospital bed, David began doing what he did best, gathering intelligence. He started with the basics, using skills he had developed over 15 years of military operations. The difference was that this time it was personal. David's first call was to the police department. He identified himself as Lisa's husband and asked to speak with whoever was handling the investigation. After being transferred 3 times, he finally reached Detective Rodriguez, who sounded tired and evasive. "Mr. Chen, I understand you want answers, but this is still an active investigation. I can't share details with you right now. Detective, my pregnant wife was shot during a traffic stop. I think I have a right to know what happened. Sir, I understand your frustration, but these things take time. The officers involved are on administrative leave while we review the incident." Administrative leave. David knew what that meant. The officers were being paid to stay home while the department tried to figure out how to handle the situation. It wasn't exactly the urgent response David had expected. After hanging up, David made another call to someone who could help him cut through the bureaucracy. Colonel Thompson had been David's commanding officer for the past 5 years and had become something like a mentor. When David explained the situation, Thompson immediately offered assistance. "David, I'm sorry to hear about Lisa. What do you need?" "I need to know what really happened, sir. The police aren't giving me any information, and something about this doesn't feel right. Give me a few hours. I'll make some calls." While waiting for Thompson to get back to him, David decided to visit the scene of the shooting. The location was only about 15 minutes from their house, on a road Lisa traveled regularly. David parked where Lisa's car had been and tried to understand what had happened. There were still broken glass fragments on the pavement and a small stain that might have been blood. David felt his jaw clench as he imagined Lisa sitting in her car, confused and scared while someone pointed a gun at her. The street was well lit and in a safe neighborhood. There was no reason for any officer to feel threatened here. David walked the area methodically, noting sight lines and potential witness locations. He spotted a convenience store across the street with security cameras pointed toward the road. That would be his next stop. The store clerk was a young man named Tony who had worked the night shift for 2 years. When David explained who he was, Tony's expression immediately changed to one of sympathy and anger. "Man, I saw the whole thing from here. It was crazy. Your wife wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just sitting in her car trying to give the cop her license. Did you see what made the officer shoot?" Tony shook his head. "That's the thing, nothing made him shoot. The first cop seemed fine, like it was just a normal traffic stop. But then the second cop showed up and everything went bad fast. He was yelling at her and pointing his gun before she even had a chance to understand what was happening." David asked Tony if the store's security cameras had captured the incident. Tony checked with his manager and confirmed that they had footage, but said they couldn't release it without a court order. David made a note to have someone with legal authority obtain that footage. Before leaving the store, David asked Tony if he would be willing to talk to investigators about what he saw. Tony agreed immediately, saying he had been wondering why nobody had asked for his statement yet. That detail bothered David. Why hadn't the police interviewed the most obvious witness to the shooting? Either they were incompetent, or they weren't trying very hard to get to the truth. Colonel Thompson called back that evening while David was sitting beside Lisa's hospital bed. Thompson had been busy making calls to contacts in federal law enforcement. "David, I've got some preliminary information, but you're not going to like it. Tell me." The officer who shot Lisa is named Daniel Henley. He's been with the local police for 3 years, and this isn't his first excessive force incident. He's had 4 complaints filed against him, but the department has buried all of them. David felt his anger growing, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of complaints?" 2 for unnecessary roughness during arrests, 1 for racial profiling, and 1 for threatening a teenager during a traffic stop. The department's Internal Affairs Division has cleared him on all charges. And they let him stay on the street? Gets worse. Henley's previous partner was shot 3 weeks ago during an unrelated incident. Word is that Henley has been unstable ever since, but nobody wanted to take him off duty because the department is already short-staffed. David closed his eyes, processing this information. So the man who shot his wife was essentially a ticking time bomb that the police department had ignored until he exploded. "There's more," Thompson continued. "I did some digging into the department itself. They've had 7 excessive force lawsuits in the past 2 years, and they've settled all of them out of court with non-disclosure agreements. This isn't an isolated incident." After the call, David sat in the darkened hospital room, listening to the steady beep of Lisa's monitors. His wife had been shot by someone who shouldn't have been carrying a gun, working for a department that had a history of covering up police violence. The system had failed at every level. David spent the next several days conducting his own investigation while staying close to Lisa's bedside. He used his military contacts and security clearance to access databases that weren't available to civilians. What he found painted an even darker picture. Officer Henley had connections to a white supremacist group that had been under FBI surveillance for the past year. The group advocated for violence against minorities and had been linked to several hate crimes in neighboring states. David found social media posts where Henley had shared their propaganda and attended their meetings. Even more disturbing, David discovered that 3 other officers in the same department had similar connections. The hate group had apparently been trying to recruit law enforcement officers to their cause, and they had found willing participants. David also learned that Officer Morrison, Henley's partner during the shooting, had tried to file a report stating that the shooting was unjustified. But his report had been altered by his supervisors to support Henley's version of events. Morrison had been told to keep quiet or face disciplinary action. Using his intelligence training, David was able to obtain copies of the original police reports before they were modified. The differences were stark. Morrison's original report clearly stated that Lisa posed no threat and that Henley had fired without justification. The modified version claimed that Lisa had been acting suspiciously and may have been reaching for a weapon. David also discovered that the police department had a pattern of altering reports to protect officers involved in questionable shootings. It wasn't incompetence, it was a deliberate cover-up. As David compiled his evidence, he realized that Lisa's shooting wasn't just about one unstable officer. It was about a corrupt system that protected bad cops and silenced good ones. The department knew they had dangerous people wearing badges, but they chose to look the other way rather than deal with the problem. Lisa was getting stronger each day, but their baby was still in danger. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but they warned that the next few weeks would be critical. Every day the baby stayed in Lisa's womb was important for development. David knew he had enough evidence to destroy the careers of everyone involved in the cover-up. But he also knew that going public too soon could backfire. The department had lawyers and resources, and they would fight back hard. David needed to be strategic about his next moves. Late one night, as David sat holding Lisa's hand, she woke up and looked at him with clear eyes. "You're planning something," she said softly. David was surprised. Even recovering from surgery and medication, Lisa could still read him perfectly. "I'm just trying to understand what happened to you." Lisa squeezed his hand weakly. "I remember more now. The officer who shot me, he wasn't scared of me. He was angry, like he wanted to hurt me." David nodded, confirming what he had already suspected. This hadn't been a case of an officer making a split-second decision under pressure. Henley had shot Lisa because he wanted to, because his hatred had overwhelmed his judgment. "What are you going to do?" Lisa asked. David looked at his wife lying in a hospital bed because someone had decided she was less than human. He thought about their unborn child fighting for life because of one man's hate. He thought about all the other families who might face the same tragedy if nothing changed. "I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else," David said quietly. Lisa smiled weakly. "Good, but promise me you'll do it the right way." David kissed her forehead. "I promise." But as he made that promise, David was already planning his next moves. He had the evidence to expose the corruption. Now he needed to find the right people to help him use it. 3 weeks after the shooting, David's daughter was born. Baby Sophie arrived at just 28 weeks, weighing barely 3 pounds. But she was a fighter, just like her mother. As David held his tiny daughter for the first time, her fingers wrapped around his thumb, he felt something shift inside his chest that was bigger than anger or revenge. Lisa had survived the surgery but faced a long recovery. The bullet had caused more damage than the doctors initially realized, and she would need several more operations. But she was alive, and she was determined to be strong for their daughter. Sophie spent her first months in the neonatal intensive care unit. David and Lisa took turns staying with her around the clock, learning to navigate the world of premature babies and medical equipment. David had faced enemy fire without flinching, but watching his daughter struggle to breathe on her own was the most terrifying experience of his life. During those long nights in the NICU, David made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. Instead of using his considerable skills to pursue personal revenge against Officer Henley, he chose a different path. David reached out to investigative journalist Rebecca Martinez, who had been following police corruption cases for years. Rebecca had a reputation for thorough research and fearless reporting. When David contacted her with his evidence, she immediately recognized the significance of what he had uncovered. "Mr. Chen, what you found here goes beyond your wife's case," Rebecca told him during their first meeting. "This is a pattern of systemic corruption that affects the entire community." David had compiled everything methodically. Police reports, witness statements, social media posts, federal surveillance data, and documentation of the cover-up attempts. He presented it all to Rebecca like a military briefing, complete with timelines and evidence chains. Rebecca spent 2 weeks verifying David's research and conducting her own interviews. She spoke with Officer Morrison, who had been struggling with guilt over his failure to prevent the shooting. Morrison finally agreed to go on record about how his reports had been altered and how he had been pressured to stay quiet. She also interviewed other victims of police violence in the area, discovering a pattern of abuse that stretched back years. David's case wasn't unique. It was just the one with the most documentation and the strongest evidence. When Rebecca's story broke, it sent shockwaves through the community. The headline read, "Military Veterans Investigation Exposes Police Corruption and Cover-Up." The article detailed not just Lisa's shooting, but the entire culture of violence and racism within the police department. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Federal authorities launched their own investigation within 24 hours. The FBI opened a civil rights case, and the Department of Justice announced they would be reviewing the entire police department's practices. But David wasn't finished. Working with civil rights attorney Patricia Johnson, he filed a federal lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Officer Henley personally. The lawsuit wasn't just about money. It demanded specific reforms to prevent future incidents. The case attracted national attention. David found himself testifying before Congress about police accountability and military veterans' transition to civilian life. He spoke calmly and factually about what had happened to his family, never letting emotion override his message. Officer Henley was arrested and charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and federal civil rights violations. During his trial, David's evidence proved crucial in securing a conviction. Henley was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, but the victory that meant the most to David was the dismissal of Police Chief Williams and 2 deputy chiefs who had orchestrated the cover-up. The entire Internal Affairs Division was disbanded and rebuilt with outside oversight. Officer Morrison, who had tried to prevent the shooting and later testified against his colleagues, became an advocate for police reform. He left the force and began working with training academies to teach de-escalation techniques. The city agreed to a settlement that included not just financial compensation for David's family, but mandatory reforms to police training, hiring, and oversight. Every officer would be required to complete bias training and de-escalation courses. Body cameras became mandatory, and all footage would be automatically reviewed by an independent civilian board. David made another choice that surprised people. When his military retirement became official, he didn't pursue a quiet civilian life. Instead, he accepted a position with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, investigating police misconduct cases across the country. His military background and personal experience made him uniquely qualified to understand both sides of violence and its consequences. David traveled to communities where police accountability was needed, helping families navigate the complex legal and bureaucratic systems. Lisa recovered slowly but completely. She returned to nursing with a new perspective on trauma and healing. She began working specifically with families who had experienced violence, using her own experience to help others cope with their darkest moments. Together, David and Lisa started a foundation focused on police accountability and support for families affected by police violence. They used David's settlement money and military connections to fund legal assistance and advocacy programs. Sophie grew up healthy and strong despite her premature birth. By her first birthday, she had caught up to other children her age. David often told her that she was the strongest person he knew, having survived her first battle. And before she was even born, the family's story became a symbol of how ordinary people could create extraordinary change when faced with injustice. David received invitations to speak at military bases, police academies, and community organizations across the country. But the moment that meant the most to David came 3 years later, when he received a letter from a young woman whose brother had been killed by police in another state. She had used David's foundation to get legal help and hold the officers accountable. Her brother's case had resulted in charges and convictions. "Your family's courage gave us hope when we had none," she wrote. "Thank you for showing us that justice is possible." David kept that letter in his desk drawer, reading it whenever he felt discouraged by the slow pace of change. It reminded him that individual actions could ripple outward in ways that touched lives he would never know. Lisa often said that their daughter had saved them all, not just by surviving, but by giving them a reason to choose healing over hatred, justice over revenge. Sophie represented the future they were fighting for, a world where every child could grow up safe from the very people sworn to protect them. David still woke up at 5:30 every morning, but now it was to help Lisa get ready for work and to make breakfast for Sophie. Their routine was different from what they had planned before the shooting, but it was theirs. Every morning, as David watched his wife and daughter share breakfast, he remembered that night in the hospital when he thought he might lose them both. The anger was still there, but it had been transformed into something more powerful, a commitment to making sure no other family would face what they had endured. The quiet life David had originally planned for his retirement was gone forever, but in its place he had found something better, a purpose that honored both his military service and his family's survival. He was still protecting people, just in a different way. Sophie's room was decorated with photos from David's speaking engagements and awards from civil rights organizations. But her favorite bedtime story wasn't about her father's military career or his fight for justice. It was the simple story of how much her parents loved each other, and how much they had wanted her to be born. David would end each story the same way, "And that's how you changed the world before you could even walk." Sophie would giggle and ask him to tell it again. And David would, because he never got tired of remembering that even in the darkest moments love could triumph over hate, and justice could emerge from tragedy.